9 ships found the eastern shore in the grey hour before a dawn that none of them had expected to see. They had crossed an ocean with no land behind them anymore. Only water where the most beautiful island in the history of the world had stood the evening before. Water closing over towers and gardens and the long avenues where their grandfathers had walked. Water that did not care what it had just swallowed and gave back nothing to mark the place. The men on those 9 ships did not look back because there was nothing behind them to look at, and they had learned already in the single night it had taken to learn it, that looking back at an absence does not bring anything closer to you. It only shows you the shape of what is gone. They came ashore with what they had carried off in the last hours. 7 seeing stones wrapped in cloth, a sapling no taller than a man's forearm with its roots bound in wet sacking, swords whose names were older than the cities that had forged them, and the specific grief of people who understood. In the same hour they understood their own survival, that survival was not the same thing as rescue. This is where their story as a separate people begins, not on the drowned island, which had its own long and magnificent account that ended the way all such accounts eventually end, but here, on a foreign coast, among people who did not know them, with nothing remaining of the world that had made them, except what 9 ships could carry, and what 3 living men remembered well enough to rebuild. They called themselves from this point forward the Dunedain, Men of the West. The name was a banner raised over an absence, a way of saying, we came from somewhere, even though the somewhere no longer exists, and we are still what that somewhere made us, even though we now have nothing but our own bodies and our own memory to prove it. Elendil stood at the head of them. He was tall, taller than the people of Middle-earth had ever seen a man stand, the inheritance of the blood that ran back through the kings of the drowned island to the half-elven mariners of an even older age. His hair and beard were dark, going to grey at this point in his long life, and his eyes carried the particular quality that all the survivors' eyes carried in those first months, the look of people who have watched something irreplaceable disappear and have decided, in the same motion as the watching, that they would spend whatever remained of their lives making sure it was not entirely lost. He was not a young man starting a kingdom. He was an old man rebuilding a fragment of one, and the difference between those 2 postures shaped everything that followed. His sons stood with him, Isildur, who had carried a wound from saving a sapling and a grief from watching everything else burn, and who moved now with the specific intensity of a man who had been changed by losing almost everything, and had decided that the part of him that remained would not be wasted. Anarion, steadier, more patient, the brother who balanced his siblings' fire with a deliberateness that the difficult years ahead would prove was exactly the temperament needed for the slower work of building something that would last. They went north into the wide country of Eriador, where the rivers ran clean and the land was empty enough to hold a kingdom without contest, and there Elendil founded Arnor. They went south as well, to the warmer lands between the White Mountains and the sea, and there Isildur and Anarion together founded Gondor, building Osgiliath as its heart on both banks of the great river Anduin, raising Minas Anor and Minas Ithil at the western and eastern approaches, like 2 watchful eyes turned toward the dark country that lay beyond the mountains to the east. They planted the sapling in Minas Ithil's courts, and it took root, and it grew, and in the evenings it bloomed with a faint light that was the last living trace, anywhere in the world, of what had been lost beneath the sea. This was the inheritance they carried forward, not a kingdom restored, because what had been would never be restored, but a kingdom remembered into new form, smaller, harder won, planted in soil that did not love them yet the way the drowned island soil had loved their fathers. They built towers that echoed towers they had lost. They kept laws that had governed a civilization 3,000 years deep, now applied to a population that numbered a fraction of what it had once been. They carried in the bodies of every man and woman among them the long lifespan and the height and the grave beauty that had marked their people apart, diminished from what their ancestors had carried, because the gift always diminished a little with each generation born outside the blessed land, but still far beyond the ordinary measure of men, still visibly the inheritance of something extraordinary. They were never going to forget what they had been. This was their strength, and it would become, across the centuries that followed, their particular and most enduring sorrow. The last alliance of elves and men broke Sauron's power at the end of the Second Age, but the victory cost the Dunedain their first king in this new land. Elendil fell on the slopes of Orodruin, his sword Narsil broken beneath him, and Isildur cut the one ring from Sauron's hand with the hilt shard that remained. He kept it. This single decision, made by a grieving son in the ash and the ruin of a battlefield where his father had just died, made with the fire of Orodruin standing open and accessible, not a day's walk away, would cost the Dunedain more than any single choice in their entire history. He called it his werigil, his rightful payment for what the war had taken from him, and he carried it north, away from the temptation of the fire that could have unmade it forever, and the carrying of it killed him. At the Gladden Fields, in the marshy lowlands along the Anduin, where the river spread into reed and shallow water, orcs ambushed his company. Isildur, last and most direct heir of the line that Elendil had carried out of the drowning, was killed there, and the ring slipped from his hand into the river as he died, and sank into the silt at his bottom, lost, not destroyed, not delivered to the fire, simply lost, where it would wait for 5 centuries until a creature with no name worth keeping found it in the dark. His sons survived him, all but the youngest. Valandil, too young to have ridden to war, became the 3rd king of Arnor, and the North Kingdom continued, diminished by a death it had not expected to suffer so soon after a victory it had only just won, but continuing. For nearly 1,000 years, Arnor stood whole. This is worth pausing on, because what followed makes it easy to forget that there was a long period, generations upon generations, in which the kingdom Elendil had founded simply existed, governed itself, raised its children long enough that catastrophe starts to feel like something that belongs to other ages. 10 kings reigned after Valandil in unbroken succession, and Numenor rose as the capital on the shore of a lake that mirrored the sky with the particular clarity of water in a kingdom that had not yet learned to distrust its own peace. The breaking, when it came, did not come from outside. It came from a father's inability to decide between his children. King Eärnur died, and his 3 sons could not agree on which of them should hold the whole inheritance, and rather than see the kingdom torn by war between brothers, they divided it instead, a decision made in grief and in the desire to avoid worse grief, which nonetheless produced exactly the slow catastrophe that war would have produced quickly. Arnor split into Arthedain in the northwest, Rhudaur in the northeast, and Cardolan in the south. 3 kingdoms where there had been one, 3 crowns descended from a single line, and the strength that had been whole was now divided 3 ways, at the precise moment that something was gathering in the cold lands further north that would spend the next 700 years exploiting exactly this division. The Witch-king of Angmar built his power in the very years that the 3 kingdoms were settling into their separateness, and the campaign he waged against them, patient, methodical, exploiting every fracture and every old resentment between the divided houses, is a story that belongs as much to the Dunedain as to him, because it is the story of what was done to them, watched from inside the watching, felt from inside the long grinding loss of land and people, and finally of the line itself. Rhudaur fell to corruption before it fell to conquest, its Dunedain rulers murdered or driven out by hillmen who allied themselves with Angmar's growing shadow, until the kingdom that had once been governed by Elendil's descendants was simply gone, absorbed into the enemy's territory, its Dunedain population scattered or dead. Cardolan held longer, fighting a defensive war against the same encroaching darkness, until plague swept through its diminished population in the wake of Angmar's campaigns and finished what the war had begun. The men of Cardolan's last defense were buried in the ancient barrows of the Downs that had stood empty and waiting since long before their own people had come to that land. And in time, this is one of the bitterest small ironies the Dunedain ever suffered. The Witch-king sent spirits to inhabit those same barrows, so that the resting place of the last defenders of one Dunedain kingdom became for centuries afterward a place haunted by the servants of the very power that had destroyed it. Arthedain held the longest, because Arthedain held the line of kings, the unbroken inheritance from Elendil through Isildur through Valandil, the crown that mattered most, because it was the crown that proved the Dunedain was still in some essential sense who they had always claimed to be. King after king of Arthedain fought the long defensive war against Angmar with this specific grim determination of people who understand that they are not merely defending land, but defending the last unbroken thread connecting them to a drowned civilization 3,000 years gone. In the year 1409 of the Third Age, the Witch-king's forces took Amon Sûl, Weathertop, and burned the great watchtower that had stood on its summit since the kingdom's founding. And the king of Arthedain died defending it, and the palantir that had been kept there was saved only by a desperate retreat that carried itself to the one ally still capable of holding ground. Because they were not entirely alone in this war. Círdan the shipwright held the western coast with his elvish folk, and Rivendell under Elrond who had chosen the long road of the elves at the very beginning, when his brother Elros had chosen the Dunedain's mortal path, who had watched his brother's descendants fight and dwindle for 2,500 years, with whatever grief an immortal carries for a kinship he cannot fully share in the dying of. Rivendell stood as the one place in the north where the line of kings could find shelter and counsel and the kind of patient long memory that no mortal kingdom, however proud, could maintain on its own. In the year 1974, after 700 years of grinding war and slow attrition, Fornost fell. King Arvedui, the last king of Arthedain, and therefore the last king of Arnor in any sense the title had meant since the founding, fled north with what remained of his household, seeking ships, seeking rescue, seeking anything that might preserve the line through one more winter until Gondor's relief, already sent for, could arrive. The ships of the Lossoth, the snowmen of the far north, took him aboard in the depth of winter, carrying him and the last Palantiri of the northern kingdom out into the Bay of Foroshel. The ship was wrecked by ice. He drowned, the last king of a line founded by men who had survived the drowning of an entire civilization, died, finally, in the cold water of a northern bay, and with him went 2 of the 7 great seeing stones that Elendil's people had carried out of the ruin of their homeland, gone into the dark water as completely and as permanently as Numenor itself had gone, the inheritance simply ending, link by link, in exactly the medium that had taken everything from this family at the very beginning. There was no king after him. There has been no king of Arnor from that day to a day that lay still 7 centuries in the future. And the absence of a king is a different kind of loss than the death of one, because death ends a single life, and the absence of a crown ends the visible proof of an entire people's continued legitimacy. The line did not end. Arvedui's sons Aralart survived him, and the line continued through Aranarth and his descendants, but it continued now as something else, not as kings, as chieftains of the Dunedain, as the heads of a people who no longer had a kingdom to rule, only a heritage to preserve, and a vigil to keep over lands that had once been theirs by right, and were now simply the wilderness their ancestors had once governed. The Rangers of the North. This is what the proudest line in the history of mortal men became. Wanderers in their own former kingdom, dressed in grey and green for the specific purpose of not being seen, sleeping in the open more often than under roofs, watching roads that no king required them to watch, and that no one thanked them for watching, because almost no one in the diminished population of Eriador remembered by this point that there had ever been a kingdom at all, let alone that there were still men walking the wild places who were its rightful heirs. This is the part of the Dunedain story that asks the most of anyone telling it honestly, because it is not a story with battles in it, not for centuries at a stretch. It is a story of patience, extended past any reasonable expectation of reward. Generation after generation of chieftains lived and led and died, watching the borders of a kingdom that the people living inside those borders no longer believed had ever existed as anything but a children's tale. The hobbits of the Shire, settled originally under the protection of the very kings whose line now walked among them unrecognized, paid no tribute, asked no permission, and largely forgot within a handful of generations that the quiet borders of their peaceful country were kept safe by men who rode the wild lands, specifically so that the hobbits could afford to forget such things existed. The ranges were tall, the Dunedain height still visible beneath travel-worn cloaks, their faces weathered by years lived almost entirely outdoors, their eyes carrying a quality that the ordinary folk who occasionally glimpsed them found unsettling without being able to say precisely why. A depth, a watchfulness, a grief held so long it had become simply part of the bone structure of the face, rather than an expression that came and went. They were called, by those who spoke of them at all, the Strider folk, or simply strangers, or, in the unkindest and most common formulation, rangers, said with the particular dismissiveness that settled people reserve for those who seem to have no settled place, no roof, no occupation that the speaker can readily name and respect. They did not correct this. They could not, without revealing what they were protecting and why, and the protecting required the secrecy more than it required the recognition. They watched the East Road. They watched the borders of the Shire with a vigilance that none of the hobbits they protected ever knew enough to thank them for. They fought, in small numbers, against the wolves and the trolls, and the worse things that came down from the empty lands, when the empty lands produced something worse. And they did this work in the dark, far from any court, far from any song, because there was no court left to commission the songs, and precious few left who would have understood them if there had been. This was their inheritance now, to be the last guard of a kingdom that no longer believed in its own existence, to carry within their own bodies and their own carefully preserved genealogies the entire remaining proof that Elendil's line had not been extinguished, and to do this work in conditions of poverty and obscurity that would have seemed to their drowned ancestors, looking on from whatever the dead are permitted to see, like the cruelest possible inversion of everything Numenor had been. And yet they did not break. This is the thing that the long centuries of the Rangers' obscurity prove, more clearly than any single battle could have proven it, that what the Dunedain carried was not merely pride in their own greatness, which would have curdled into resentment or despair under this much sustained diminishment, but something more durable, a sense of duty that did not require an audience, a faithfulness that asked nothing in return for being maintained, generation folding into generation, each chieftain raising a son to take up the same watch under the same conditions of invisibility, because the watch mattered, regardless of who noticed it was being kept. Meanwhile, in the south, Gondor's story ran a different course, though it bent, in the end, towards the same accumulating grief. The southern kingdom prospered longer than the northern one, its position better defended by mountain and river, its population larger, its line of kings, descending through Anarion since Isildur's death at the Gladdenfields, had left that line in his brother's hands, holding firm through centuries in which Arnor was already fracturing. Gondor built its glory in stone, Osgiliath spanning the Anduin with its great bridge, the white walls of Minas Anor climbing the mountain spur that would later bear a different name, the long line of kings ruling from a throne that, unlike Arnor's, was never divided among quarreling heirs. But Gondor's strength was always purchased at a cost that the southern kingdom paid in its own particular currency, proximity to Mordor. Where Arnor bled out slowly under Angmar's patient strangulation, Gondor faced its enemy directly, across a mountain range and a river, in a confrontation that never fully ended, for as long as anything lived in the Black Land to sustain it. The plague came in the year 1636, the Great Plague, sweeping up from the south on winds that carried it indifferently across every border, killing king and peasant with the same democratic thoroughness, emptying Osgiliath of enough of its population that the city, once the unified capital straddling both banks of the river, was abandoned as a seat of government and left to crumble slowly into the kind of ruin that takes centuries to complete. The kings moved their court to Minas Anor on the western bank, and Osgiliath stood empty and broken from that point forward, a visible wound in the heart of the kingdom that nothing afterward ever fully healed. The line of kings in the south continued for another 1,000 years past the plague, through wars with the Wain Riders out of the east and the long internal catastrophe of the Kin-strife, a civil war fought over the question of pure Dunedain blood that the kingdom never quite recovered its full strength from, the population thinned further by the specific waste of brother killing brother over a question of lineage purity that the drowned ancestors, watching, might have recognized with a particular bitterness as their own pride turned inward and made to consume itself. And then, in the year 2050 of the Third Age, King Eärnur rode out to answer a challenge from the Lord of the Nazgul himself, issued in contempt outside the gates of Minas Morgul, and did not return. He had no heir. The line of kings that had descended unbroken from Anarion since the founding, the half that had held firm while the north fractured, simply ended there, at the gates of a tower that had once been a city of moon-pale beauty, before Sauron's servants made it into something else. Gondor passed, from that day, into the rule of the Stewards, the line descending from Mardil, who had governed faithfully in Eärnur's absence, and who, when no king returned and no heir could be found to claim the throne, simply continued to govern, generation after generation, in the king's name, on the king's behalf, keeping the throne empty, rather than claiming it for his own house, because the stewards of Gondor held to a fidelity that the long absence of any king to be loyal to never quite managed to extinguish. The throne in the great hall of Minas Tirith stood empty for nearly 1,000 years. The stewards ruled wisely on the whole and bravely, and the kingdom under their care held the line against Mordor through century after century of war that never fully stopped. But the empty throne sat at the heart of every council, every feast, every coronation that was not a coronation, because there was no one left with the blood right to be crowned. A visible, permanent reminder that something essential had been lost, and that no steward, however capable, was quite the same thing as what had been lost. This is where the two halves of Elendil's inheritance arrived, by the middle centuries of the Third Age, at a strange and sorrowful symmetry. In the north, a line of kings still living, still unbroken, but reduced to wandering exiles that almost no one believed were real. In the south, a kingdom still standing, still proud, still fighting, but with no king at all, only the memory of one, and the patient stewardship of men who governed in a dead king's name. It would take the descendant of the northern line, walking south at last after 2,000 years of his ancestors' obscurity, to bring the two halves back into any kind of contact with each other. And it would take the entire weight of the War of the Ring to make that meeting matter. His name, when he was finally given one that mattered, was Aragorn. He was born in the year 2931 of the Third Age, the son of Arathorn II, chieftain of the Dunedain, the latest in the long, unbroken chain stretching back through Aranarth to Arvedui, drowned in the northern ice, to Isildur, dead in the reeds of the Gladden fields, to Elendil, fallen before the Black Gate, to the kings of a drowned island that no living person had seen with their own eyes.
He was 2 years old when his father was killed by orcs while out riding. A small, almost anonymous death, the kind that the rangers suffered routinely and that the wider world never heard of, except that this death left the entire weight of an ancient inheritance resting on a child too young to understand what had just been placed on him.
Gilraen, his mother, brought him to Rivendell. Elrond received them. Elrond, who had now watched this exact pattern repeat itself for the better part of 3,000 years. The long mortal line he had loved since its founding, continuing to produce children who inherited danger along with their birthright, continuing to lose fathers young, continuing to need the shelter that only an immortal house with an immortal memory could reliably provide. He fostered the boy as his own.
He gave him, for safety, a different name, Estel, which meant hope in the tongue of the elves, a name chosen specifically to conceal from the child himself, for as long as concealment could be maintained, that he was the heir to a kingship that several powerful enemies would have been glad to extinguish before it could ever be claimed. Aragorn grew up in Rivendell, not knowing his own lineage. He grew tall, the Dunedain inheritance fully present in him, perhaps more fully present than in any of his immediate predecessors, as if the long centuries of careful preservation had concentrated rather than diminished what the blood carried. His hair was dark, his eyes grey and clear, his face marked even in his youth by a gravity that the other children fostered alongside him in Elrond's house found difficult to match in play, though he was capable of warmth and laughter when the circumstances allowed it. He learned the lore of the elves, the history of his own people as Elrond chose to share it with him, in the careful, incremental way of someone managing a truth too large to deliver all at once. The languages and the skills of healing, and the deep, patient wisdom that only a household as old as Rivendell could transmit. When he was 20 years old, Elrond told him who he was. The telling is not described in any great detail in the surviving accounts, but its consequence is. From that day forward, Aragorn carried, consciously and completely, the entire weight that his ancestors had carried since the drowning, the knowledge that he was the last living proof that Elendil's line had not failed, that somewhere in the wreckage of 2 broken kingdoms, there remained one man who could, in theory, if circumstances ever permitted it, reunite what his many times great-grandfather's quarrelling sons had divided. The same year, walking in the gardens of Rivendell at dusk, in the season when the trees were singing the song of Eldarion's coming, he saw Arwen. She had been away for a long time, visiting her mother's people in Lothlorien, and she had returned, changed, in the way that elves sometimes change after long absences. Not aged, because elves do not age in the way mortals do, but deepened, the long perspective of her people's millennia, visible in her bearing, in a way it had not quite been visible before she left. She was the daughter of Elrond and Celebrian, and through her mother she carried the blood of Galadriel and of Luthien before her. the same lineage, astonishingly, that ran through Aragorn's own ancestry by a different and more distant road, so that the two of them, meeting in that garden, were in some far-removed sense kin, descendants of the same ancient unions between mortal and immortal that had produced Eärendil, and through him both the line of Elrond and the line of Elendil. She was, by every account that has survived, the most beautiful living being then walking in Middle-earth, called Undoniel, the Even Star, because she carried in her face something of the same light that her ancestress Luthien had carried, a beauty that seemed to gather the last of the elder days into a single living presence at the very moment those days were fading from the world. Her hair was dark, her eyes grey like her father's, and there was in her bearing the particular stillness of someone who had lived long enough to have stopped being surprised by very much, a stillness that Aragorn's sudden, complete, and entirely unprepared falling in love disturbed in a way that neither of them, in that first evening, fully understood the consequences of. He loved her from that moment with a singleness of purpose that shaped the rest of his life. She did not, at first, return it with the same immediacy. She had lived nearly 3,000 years by the time they met, and a mortal man's sudden devotion was not, to a being of her age and experience, something to be answered lightly or quickly. Elrond, for his part, loved Aragorn as a son and respected what was growing in him, but could not, in that hour, give his blessing to a match between his only daughter and a mortal man with no kingdom, no certain future, and an inheritance that consisted mostly of danger and obscurity. He told Aragorn, not unkindly, but with complete clarity, that his daughter's hand would be earned, if it was to be earned at all, only by a man who had proven himself capable of reclaiming what his ancestors had lost, only by a king, not merely a chieftain wandering the wilderness with a claim no one currently living would honor. This is the engine that drove the next 30 years of Aragorn's life. A love he could not yet claim, attached to a destiny he had not yet fulfilled, and the patient, grinding work of becoming worthy of both. He left Rivendell and went out into the world incognito, the way his ancestors had learned to move through that world for 2,000 years, except that he carried into his wandering a purpose beyond mere survival. He served Thengel, who would become king of Rohan, in that kingdom's wars, learning the ways of horsemen and earning a respect that he could not, at the time, fully claim under his own name. He travelled into the far countries of Rhûn and Harad, into lands that the people of the West knew only as rumour, learning the shape of Sauron's growing power and the movements of his servants from positions deep inside territory that no army of the free peoples could safely have entered. He came to Gondor under the name Thorongil, Eagle of the Star, a name chosen for the star-shaped brooch he wore, and served Ecthelion II, the steward, with such distinction that he became, within a few years, the most celebrated captain in the kingdom's service. He led the assault that took Umbar's haven from the corsairs who had long used it as a base for raiding Gondor's coasts, sailing in with a small fleet under cover of darkness and burning the greater part of the enemy's ships at anchor before the garrison even understood it was under attack.
a victory that the songs of Gondor would remember for generations, attributed to a captain who vanished from the king's service almost immediately after achieving it, departing south and east into lands unknown without explanation, leaving behind a steward's son, Denethor,
who had watched this brilliant stranger's rise with a jealousy that would shape his own later choices in ways the kingdom would eventually have cause to regret.
He did not tell Ecthelion who he was. He could not yet claim the name that would have explained the resemblance between his deeds and the legends of Elendil's line, because he had not yet earned, by his own private accounting, the right to claim it. And so he served brilliantly under a borrowed name, achieved what few men in Gondor's history had achieved, and walked away from the recognition entirely, vanishing back into the wilderness to continue the long, lonely, unglamorous work of being a ranger.
He met Gandalf during these years, and the friendship between them, the wandering wizard and the wandering heir, both of them moving through Middle-earth in disguises of one kind or another, both of them carrying knowledge of the gathering shadow that almost no one else in the world was positioned to fully understand, became one of the central relationships of the age. Together, over the years that followed, they tracked the movements of the creature Gollum, suspecting what he had once carried, and Aragorn himself, after a long and grueling pursuit through the dead marshes and the foothills of Mordor, captured the wretched creature and delivered him to Thranduil's halls in Mirkwood for safekeeping and questioning. A single, unglamorous act of patient hunting that would prove, years later, to have been one of the most consequential deeds of the entire war, because what Gollum eventually revealed under that captivity confirmed for Gandalf and Aragorn both exactly what the ring that a hobbit named Baggins now possessed actually was.
He returned to Rivendell when he was 49 years old and found Arwen there again, and this time beneath the trees of Seren Omroth in Lothlorien, where they walked together in the spring, with the golden light of the Malnorn trees falling around them in the particular quality that only that one hill in all of Middle-earth seemed to hold. She gave him her answer. They plighted their troth there, on that hill, in a moment the songs would later treat as one of the few purely joyful moments in the entire account of the War of the Ring's approach, and even this joy carried its grief folded inside it, because Arwen, in choosing Aragorn, was choosing also the mortality that came with him. She would grow old as he grew old. She would die as he died, in the way that mortals die, forfeiting the long, undying road west that every other choice available to her would have kept open. Her father understood this with the particular clarity of someone who had made himself the opposite choice from the one his own brother Elros had made at the dawn of the Second Age, and the grief of it, layered on top of his genuine love for Aragorn, was something Elrond carried through every year that remained before the wedding could finally take place. The years that followed were the hardest of the long Dunedain vigil's final stretch, Sauron's strength rising visibly now, the Nazgûl abroad in the world searching for the ring that Bilbo Baggins and then Frodo had carried without fully understanding what they held, and Aragorn, under the name Strider, taking up the dangerous and thankless task of guarding the borders of the Shire itself, protecting a population of small, comfortable, entirely unsuspecting people who had no idea that the grim-faced ranger, occasionally glimpsed at the edges of Bree, was the rightful king of the very land that gave their forefathers permission to settle there in the first place.
It was in Bree, in the common room of the Prancing Pony, that Frodo Baggins finally met him, a tall, weathered man in a worn green-grey cloak, his face shadowed under a hood, regarded by the local folk with the particular wary suspicion that the Rangers had endured for 2,000 years, called Strider behind his back, without affection. He revealed himself only when the danger had grown too great to manage through caution alone, and what he showed them, alongside the sword he carried, broken, its blade reduced to a shard, much like the one his ancestor Isildur had once carried away from his father's death, was the first proof any of them had that there was more to this gaunt stranger than the dismissive name suggested. The journey south through Weathertop and the flight to the ford of Bruinen, the long road through Hollin and Moria's shadow and Lothlorien's golden refuge, the breaking of the fellowship at Amon Hen. Through all of this, Aragorn carried a double burden that none of his companions fully shared: the duty of guiding and protecting the Ring-bearers' company, and the so building understanding that the choices he made in this war would determine not merely the outcome of the conflict, but whether 2,000 years of his family's patient, obscure, unrewarded vigilance would finally mean something, or would simply end, unfinished, in the same darkness it had always been holding back. After Boromir's death, and Frodo and Sam's departure towards Mordor alone, Aragorn made the choice that defined him as a leader rather than merely a guardian. He turned to pursue the orcs who had taken Merry and Pippin, rather than following the ring-bearer he had sworn to protect, because the living companions in immediate danger needed him in a way the ring-bearer, beyond his reach now, did not. This choice led him through Fangorn Forest's edge, into Rohan's grasslands, into the company of Éomer and the Riders of the Mark, and eventually to Helm's Deep, where he fought beside Theoden's people in the desperate defense of the Hornburg against Saruman's Uruk-hai host, a battle that, while it raged, had nothing directly to do with the ring at all, and everything to do with whether Rohan would survive as an ally at all by the time the larger war reached its crisis. It was after Helm's Deep, with the war's centre of gravity shifting decisively towards Gondor, that Aragorn made the choice his ancestors had been waiting 2,000 years for, one of their line to be ready to make. He took the paths of the dead. The dead men of Dun Harrow had been cursed in the Second Age, men of the White Mountains who had sworn allegiance to Isildur against Sauron, and then broken that oath when the moment of testing came, worshippers of the old enemy who refused the summons to the war that ended the Second Age, and who were cursed by Isildur in his fury to remain unable to rest until they fulfilled the oath they had broken. For 3,000 years they had waited in the dark beneath the mountains, neither living nor properly dead, bound by a curse that only the heir of Isildur himself had the standing to release. Aragorn went into that darkness with Legolas and Gimli and a small company of his own kinsmen, the Rangers of the North who had ridden south at last, summoned by messages sent ahead to stand with their chieftain at the hour his ancestors had spent 2 millennia preparing him for. He went into the mountains dark with the dead pressing around him on every side, their voices, their cold, their ancient unresolved fury at being made to wait so long for a summons they had once refused, and he called the oath due in the name of the heir of Isildur, and the dead after 3,000 years, finally answered.
They followed him out of the mountain and down to the southern coast at Pelargir, where the corsairs of Umbar had brought a fleet to strike at Gondor's undefended rear at the very moment the city most needed every soldier it could find. And the army of the dead swept through that fleet and that harbour with a force that no living enemy could meaningfully resist. Not warriors anymore, in any sense that mattered, but the unfinished business of an oath 3,000 years overdue, finally, terribly, completely paid. He released them at Pelargir, the oath fulfilled, and took instead the living men of the captured ships, the freed slaves of Gondor, and the southern allies who had crewed the corsair vessels, and sailed them up the Anduin toward Minas Tirith, where the city lay under siege, the Witch-king's forces having broken the Great Gate, the battle on the Pelennor fields already turning desperate, Theoden already fallen, Éowyn and Merry having already brought down the Lord of the Nazgul in the desperate stand that the prophecy of 1,000 years before had finally, precisely fulfilled. The black ships came up the river flying, by every appearance the enemy, and the despair that sight produced in the defenders below, who believed for one terrible moment that the last reinforcement they had hoped for had instead become one more enemy fleet arriving to finish them, was answered when the banner Arwen had made for him unfurled from the masthead, the white tree of Gondor, the 7 stars of Elendil's house, the crown above them all, blazoned in mithril and gold against a black field, and Aragorn himself standing at the prow, as the ships ran in among the fleeing forces of Mordor, and turned the tide of the entire battle in the space of an hour. He fought through the rest of that day on the Pelennor fields, and in its aftermath, in the houses of healing, he walked among the wounded and the dying, and called for Kingsfoil, Athelas, the herb that the healers of Gondor had nearly forgotten the use of, dismissing it as a weed of no particular virtue, and crushed it in water heated over a flame, and the scent of it filled the room with something the old songs claimed could clear a weary mind better than any wine. And he laid his hands on Faramir, son of Denethor, fevered and dying from the black breath, and a wound the Witch-king's dart had given him, and on Éowyn, shield maiden of Rohan, broken in body and in spirit from the duel that had ended the Witch-king's 3,000-year existence, and on Merry the Hobbit, smallest and least likely of all the wounded to be remembered by history, and he healed them, not by magic in any flashy sense, but by the specific inheritance that ran in his blood, and his blood alone, the proof undeniable to anyone who witnessed it, that the hands that healed that day were the hands of a true and rightful king returned. The word spread through the city before the battle's grief had even finished settling. The king's hands are the hands of a healer, and ever shall it be known so. The oldest prophecy concerning his line, repeated for 2,000 years by people who had largely stopped believing it would ever be tested, had just been tested in a room full of the dying by a man who had spent his entire life until that exact hour being mistaken for nothing more than a vagabond with a sword. He would not yet enter the city as its king. He waited outside its walls, raising instead the standard of the stewards beside his own, refusing to claim the crown of a kingdom still under siege, still facing the final and most desperate confrontation of the entire war, the march to the Black Gate itself,
a deliberate sacrifice of an army too small to win outright, sent to draw Sauron's full attention away from the two small figures somewhere on the slopes of Mount Doom, that the entire war had, in the end, always actually been about.
He stood before the Black Gate and spoke for the army of the West, when the parley with Sauron's emissary turned, as everyone present understood it would, into nothing but a delay before the final assault. And he fought in that last battle on the slopes of the Morannon, surrounded on every side by the full weight of Mordor's remaining strength, with no expectation, by his own private accounting and the accounting of every man who stood beside him, of surviving the day.
The ring went into the fire while that battle still raged. Mount Doom's eruption, visible even from the gate, and the sudden collapse of every orc, control, and servant of the Dark Tower into confusion and flight, as the will that had organized them simply ceased to exist. This was the moment the entire war had been built toward, and Aragorn, standing in the ruin of the battlefield with the army of the West around him and the mountain burning in the east, understood before almost anyone else present exactly what it meant.
He entered Minas Tirith as its king at last, in the spring of the year that the Fourth Age would later count as its first, crowned by Gandalf with the ancient crown of Gondor that had not been worn since Eärnur rode to his death before Minas Morgul 1,500 years before. He took the name Elisar, Elfstone, and the regnal title Telcontar, founder of a new line that nonetheless was, in every sense that mattered, the unbroken continuation of the oldest line of men in the world.
He found, on the slopes of Mount Mindol Ewan above the city, a young sapling of the White Tree, the last surviving descendant of the very seedling Isildur had bled to save from the burning of Nimloth in Armanellos 2 ages before, growing in secret on the mountain's snowline, where some forgotten hand had carried a seed centuries before. He brought it down himself and planted it in the court of the fountain, replacing the long-dead tree that had stood withered there since before his birth, and watched it take root in soil that had waited a very long time for exactly this.
Arwen came to him that summer. Elrond brought her south himself in a procession that the people of Gondor remembered for the rest of their lives, and the wedding that followed, on Midsummer's Day, in the city that her ancestors and his had between them founded and lost and finally reclaimed across 3,000 years of grief, joined together in a single ceremony every thread of the long story, the line of Elendil and the line of Elrond, the blood of drowned Numenor and the blood of fallen Doriath, the mortal world and the world that was already, in that very season, beginning its long withdrawal from Middle-earth forever. He reunited the two kingdoms his ancestors' quarreling sons had divided 3,000 years before. He restored the watch over Arnor's old territory, raised the rangers who had guarded it in secret for 2 millennia to the honor and recognition they had never once asked for, and had earned it with a thoroughness no other people in the history of Middle-earth had matched. He reigned for 120 years, the longest reign of any king of the Dunedain since the downfall, with a wisdom and a justice that the songs of the New Age, composed by people who had no memory at all of what the old grey-cloaked strangers at the edges of their world had once protected them from,
celebrated as the beginning of everything good that followed.
And then, in the year 120 of the Fourth Age, at the age of 210, the longest lived of any king of men since Numenor's downfall, the full measure of his ancestors' gift returned to him after 2,000 years of diminishment. He felt his strength beginning, finally, to fail.
He did not wait for the failing to become humiliation. This was the last gift his blood had given him, the awareness and the choice that came with it. He went to the House of the Kings, in the silent street of the dead beneath Minas Tirith mountain, and he laid himself down on the bed prepared for him. And he said farewell to his son Eldarion, and to his people, and last of all, in words the songs would carry for as long as anyone in Middle-earth still told stories at all, to Arwen.
She had given up the undying road for him 200 years before, on a hill in Lothlorien with golden light falling around them, and she had known then exactly what the choice cost, and had made it anyway, and had not regretted it across 2 centuries of a marriage, and a kingdom, and a son, and 120 years of watching the man she loved grow old in the specific way that mortals grow old. Now, standing beside the bed where he lay dying, by his own choice rather than by failure, she understood the second half of the cost, the half that came after, the part where she would go on, alone, in a world that no longer held the one thing she had given up everything else to keep.
He told her that he did not give her only sorrow. He told her to remember that they had not been given in this world merely a memory. He died there, and the grace that had marked him in life did not leave his face in death. The old songs say he looked in that last moment like a king passing into a great sleep rather than a death, the long beauty of his line's heritage settling over him one final time.
Arwen left the city. She went north, alone, to Lothlorien, to the same golden hill at Ceren Amroth, where she had given him her answer 200 years before, where the Mollorn trees still bloomed in the particular light that had always seemed on that one hill, slightly more golden than anywhere else in Middle-earth. The elves who had once lived there were gone by then, sailed west across the sea with everyone else of the elder days, and the hill stood empty, except for the trees and the grass, and the long quiet that settles over a place once its people have left it.
She lay down there in the winter when the leaves had fallen and the trees were bare, and she died alone, the only one of her kind who had ever chosen mortality and faced its final hour without a single living soul of her own ancient people beside her to ease the passing. She was buried on that hill, and the grass grew green over the place, and for a long time afterward, the accounts say, it remained as if a memory of beauty lingered there even after all who could remember it firsthand were gone.
This is what the Dunedain finally were when the long story closed. A people who had walked out of a drowning, carrying nothing but ships and seedlings, and the stubborn unwillingness to let 3,000 years of catastrophe convince them that what they had been was not worth preserving. They had been kings, and then exiles, and then wanderers, mistaken for vagabonds in their own ancestral country, and then, for one brief, shining century, kings again. And the price of every part of that long arc had been paid, generation after generation, by people who mostly never lived to see whether the payment would ever be redeemed. Most of them never did see it. Arvedui, drowning in the northern ice, did not see it. The nameless chieftains who died defending a kingdom no one believed still existed did not see it. Arathorn, killed by orcs while his son was still too young to understand what he had lost, did not see it.
Only Aragorn saw it. At the very end of the line, after 2,000 years of his ancestors' patient and largely unrewarded faith, and even he, in the final accounting, paid for it the same way they all had, with a wife who outlived him into a solitude that nothing in the long story of either of their peoples had ever quite prepared her for, dying alone on a hill where the golden light still fell, in a forest that had already, by then, gone quiet, in a world that the very victory she had helped secure was already beginning to leave behind.
The hill at Seren Amroth is still green, though no one now living has walked there to confirm it. The moorlawn trees, if any remain, bloom each spring in a light that no one is left to call particularly golden. In Minas Tirith, the white tree still stands in the court of the fountain, the descendant of a descendant of a descendant, carrying in its roots the long, unbroken thread that ran from the light of the world's first morning through every disaster the Dunedain ever survived. It blooms each evening with the faint light it has always carried. No one remembers anymore exactly how far back that light goes, but it is still there. It was always, in the end, the only thing that mattered enough to carry all this way.